Hello everyone, this is James Shore with Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. You're watching The Lab, which is where we explore, experiment, and generally mess about. And today in the lab, we are wrapping up our three-part series on Ember.js, the front-end framework. This has been a big review and we've still got a lot left to come for you. In part one, we looked at the basics of Ember. How do we get it up and running and how does it work? In part two, we started building our financial projector application. That's what you see here. And we built out all of the value objects and custom rendering needed to display this table that we have for our stock market projection. Now, today in part three, we're going to implement the configuration fields, get those set up with custom fields, and get it all hooked together. I have 6 chapters for you today. First, we're going to look at custom form fields, get those configuration fields up and running. Then we'll look at cross-component communication. How do we get those form fields to talk to our persistence layer and back to the overall configuration panel? Then we'll look at cross-application communication. How do we get that configuration information to influence the actual projection table? And then Ember had an issue with performance. So we will take some time looking at the performance issue and what we learned from it, and wrap up with real-time updates or server-side updates before concluding and going through our list of pitfalls and what we have learned about Ember and whether or not it is a good tool to use. There's a lot of content here, so as always, you can use the timestamps here to jump to sections of interest. And of course, the source code is available to download here at the link on your screen. Before we dive in, let me catch you up real quick. We are working on the same kind of projection we've worked for our other reviews. The application is in source client UI for the most part. This is where all of our Ember code lives. We've got these templates, which are handlebars templates, component, the code that goes along with those handlebars templates in the corresponding JavaScript files. For all the details on that, see last episode. And in this review, we are looking at several pitfalls: lock-in, opinionated architecture, accidental complexity, testability, and server-side rendering. And we will get lots of information on that as we continue on. But rather than recapping anymore, let's just get right to it. Thank you for joining me, and welcome to the lab. Now that we have our table rendering and connecting to our domain model correctly, the next thing to do is to get input working. We've got these fields here that need to do the same sort of rendering. They need to render a little bit differently when the user types in a negative value, and especially when they type in an invalid value, we need an icon to show up here. You can see that here in our Java application. When I type an invalid value, we get that little icon there in the corner. The way this is implemented in our web app is going to be with CSS styles. Should be pretty straightforward, but I'm a little bit concerned about how difficult this is going to be to test. I've definitely run into a lot of testing issues as we go. So if we have problems, I'm guessing that's where they'll come from. Okay, the code that we're going to be modifying is our configuration field, and that is defined here in our configuration field handlebar template and reference from our configuration panel. We don't have any JavaScript around this yet. And before we start test driving that, I want to make a little bit of a change here to make this a bit more idiomatic Ember. Specifically, rather than hard coding this configuration, which actually needs to be one of several values, you can see it here in the Java application that it's going to either be starting balance, cost basis, or yearly spending. So what I'm thinking is that I'll take advantage of Ember's block format where we can say starting balance and cost basis and yearly spending. The way we do that is we turn the component reference, we put a pound inside of it, in front of it, which is some sort of HTML bars, handlebars configuration thing, and then end with a slash to say that we're closing the tag. And then inside the field, rather than hard coding this value, we use the yield helper like that. And having done that, we should now be able to run the app and see our fields come out. There we go. So just a minor little change to make it a little bit more idiomatic for the way Ember likes to do things. And I do like this. Now let's actually start test driving this. Okay, I've got some simple boilerplate set up here for our configuration field. Nothing happening here yet, just set up the tests, and I'm inputting a user enter dollars, which is how the fields work, with nothing in it. So the first thing I want to test is just make sure that it renders the text. And hopefully this is as straightforward as finding the input field and expecting the value of that field to equal the user entered dollar amount. Okay, that's failing as expected. We're getting nothing, but we're expecting 1, 2, 3, 4. Now making this work is a matter of putting the correct value in our input helper. And in this case, let's call it text. And also putting the correct property here. I'm going to set this to food to start with. We should see this say expected food equal 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, it does. And now I'm going to set this to the value property, which we have passed in. And actually, I'm going to make that return value.toString. And this will be a property that depends on value, and we need to do a this.get here. And that should make this pass. And it almost does, except that it's rendering it out with the $ and comma. What we need to do here is get the user entered text. Okay, that is looking pretty good. The next thing to do is to get this to render illegal values. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and refactor this to use the self-rendering approach that we did for our table cells. I'm going to go ahead and speed through this because it's very similar to what we did with the table cells. Okay, I factored out a render target just like we did for the stock market cell. This is very specific to the configuration field in that we're not asking the value object for the text to render. Instead, we're just outputting the user's text directly. And we're also not looking at whether or not it's negative, but we are looking at whether it's invalid and the tooltip. So now what I want to do is test that. We'll test that it renders illegal values. So we'll set the value to X. Now in this case, the input field needs to have a class on it. So expect the value of the input field to be the same, because we don't overwrite the user's input. So this should still pass. And it does. But we also want to say that the input field has the class invalid. And that will be false because we haven't coded that yet. Yeah, there it is. Expected true, but was false. Implementing that should just be a matter of just like in the stock market cell, we want to do a class name binding, but this time we'll do it on invalid. And we'll set up the invalid function to return true or false based on that rendered value. And that should work. Oh, but no, it's not going to, because this binds it to the configuration field, but we actually don't want it on the configuration field, which would be on the div that surrounds this component. We actually want it specifically on the input. I believe we can just say class equals invalid and have that work. And we won't do our class name binding, although that was the wrong binding anyway, but hey, and that worked. Good. We also want our attribute, our title attribute for our tooltip, to be invalid dollar amount. We'll get that just like before, and then we'll need to set it here. And I think we can just say again, title equals tooltip. Yeah, and that's working. Now similarly, we want our legal values to not have that class and to not have the tooltip. So we'll expect invalid to be false and the title to be undefined for our legal values. And that works. Okay, that renders our initial value, whatever it may be, but what about when the user changes the value? We want it to react to changes in user input. So here, we need a way to programmatically change the field and trigger the events that Ember is going to hook into. Okay, I've wired up some hard-coded data here into our configuration panel just to demonstrate that it is rendering those initial values correctly, but when we change it, it's not changing back and forth like it's supposed to. So not only do we need to figure out how to test changes to the field, the production code isn't working. I thought it might work automatically, but it's not. So we need to figure out how to get the production code to react to those change events as well. Okay, I'm a little bit closer. I have figured out how to get Ember to react to changes in the text field. Now we are binding the value of the text field to the text property, which is a readable property. But the thing is you can also, Ember will call these functions as well when the value is changed. There are 3 parameters that are sent into us, key value and previous value. And the only way you can tell if Ember is getting versus setting is to check to see if the number of parameters is greater than 1. So if arguments.length is greater than 1, then we can see that the text has changed to this new value. So if we do that, let's go ahead and run it. If we do that, we should see a console log come out here every time the text is changed. Yeah, excellent. So what that means is that when the value changes, what we can do is set the value to a new user entered dollars with the new value. And if we run that, we will hopefully now see, yes, there's our icon. It is changing as needed. So that's cool. That answers the question of how do we react to user changes. But how do we test drive this line of code? That's still an open question. I'm going to keep looking into it. Well, it has been an adventuresome couple of hours over here at Let's Code JavaScript headquarters. And by adventuresome, I mean totally sucking. I have failed. I was not able to figure out how to programmatically trigger events with Ember such that it would lead to this configuration field changing the text value. It just, I couldn't figure it out. It may be possible, but I certainly can't make it happen. And this took me on a very, very windy road. First thing I looked at was Ember's integration tests, or what they call integration tests. Gives you a bunch of helpers, which are global variables or global functions that you can call. And one of them is fill in, that changes the value of a text field. That seems like a really great tool, right? You'd think so. But when I tried to use it, oh boy, did that just take me down an incredible rabbit hole. First off, if you try to use any of these asynchronous helpers with Mocha, you will get complaints that QUnit isn't defined. So what I had to do was define my own test adapter for Mocha to define async start, async end, and exception. Async start and async end basically are workarounds, as far as I can tell, for QUnit having kind of a screwy way of handling asynchronous logic. I don't think we didn't actually need to do anything with these, because in Mocha, you can just pass the done parameter in and then call done when your test is done. But so I implemented that, and there's some time burnt trying to figure out what this is and how to make it go and so forth. Of course, it's not really clearly documented. So once I had that working, I had the ability to run fill in. And then after fill in goes, you call and that will be executed after the fill in does its thing. And then I call done at the end. And the input field value was changing, but it was not triggering this line of code right here. It was not saying that the text field had changed. so you can see it. Here, you can see I'm going through, doing everything, setting the new value and successfully changing it, but we are not seeing that this text set is being called. So I spent some more time, burned more time digging into this and digging into this, and of course reading Ember code, because that seems to be the way to program in Ember. I'm a little frustrated. And I eventually drill down, and this right here, my friends, this is the line of code that runs when you call fill-in. It would have been nice if they just documented that that's what it does. All it's doing is using jQuery to change the value of the text field, which I'd tried already, and then calling the change event, triggering a change event. And that change event is not doing anything. I don't know if it's because of the way I have my test set up or what. I actually went through and tried triggering all kinds of events. In my tests, the way they're set up now, which is the best way I know how to set them up, that change event does nothing, which means that this code is never run because Ember never realizes that the text has changed. It works fine in production, but the tests do not, that change event does nothing. Bottom line, I can't see any way to trigger a text change event in a test. And really working with these integration test handlers, which are really, as far as I can tell, just very complicated wrappers for jQuery, which is synchronous. They're turning synchronous jQuery event triggers into asynchronous functions. I don't even understand why they're doing that. Anyway, doesn't work. I'm giving up. It's defeated me. Fortunately, there is something we can do instead, which is way, way simpler. We can just set the value manually. We can say component.setText to a new value, and that will cause my text field change line to execute. Pretty straightforward. Now, the downside of that is that, again, we're short-circuiting our HTML bars, our handlebars, which means that it is a little less real. So I'm not thrilled about that, but honestly, at this point, I'm going to call it good enough. So to write this test, all we need to do is set the text and then expect the input field value to equal new value and the invalid class to be set. Now that should fail because we're not setting that new value yet. But if I come into here, change this, that should do it. Oh, and we're getting some complaints here. What we need to do when we set something is we need to wrap it in ember.run. Again, I'm not entirely sure why that is, and it is synchronous, but that's what we got to do. And I'll take out that done because we don't need it anymore. And there we go. It passes. And that, I think, finishes our custom form field. Let me just go ahead and run the application manually. Yeah, we've got that value coming and going just like it should. It is being tested now, which is great. And in the end, I mean, Ember has been really annoying to work with because once you get off the happy path, it's just really poorly documented. But in the end, the fact that we're not actually triggering an event and instead setting this text, that's not a huge problem. The main problem here is if we set this to value, for example, I think all of our tests would still pass. Well, actually, in this case, it doesn't. My concern is, though, that there are ways we could break configuration field, the HTML bars or handlebars template here, because we're never actually testing the template directly. But this is actually pretty good. My frustration with Ember, again, is how hard it is to figure out how to do stuff like this. Now that I've got it going, it's not too bad. Now that we have our configuration fields converting to value objects and handling the different types of rendering we need to do, and we have our stock market table doing what it needs to do with our value objects and rendering negatives and invalid values and everything, the next thing to do is to hook them up to each other. We need the values here to be used to create the projection that we display here. Right now, that projection is just hard-coded so we can have something to look at. In order to do that, we need to get the data out of our configuration fields and into a new piece of our domain layer that I haven't talked about yet, and that is our persistence layer. This is a simulation of our connection to the server. Now, it doesn't actually talk to a server. I don't have any sort of server component to this application, but in a real-world application, I would, and this persistence object simulates that. It stores our user-entered information and provides events or provides change notification when those values change. So we need to get any changes that happen here to be put into this user configuration object, which would then simulate sending that off to the server and responding to changes from the server as well. And when that user configuration object changes, we need to update this table. The first challenge, I think, is just getting the information into the user configuration object. These individual fields don't know anything about the user configuration, and in previous reviews on other frameworks, the way I've managed that is inside the configuration panel, and I think I'll continue doing that because it's worked well in the past. So what that means is that we need to create a configuration panel, which right now is just mocked up with hard-coded data. We need to have this somehow send the configuration field information to the configuration fields. So the individual cost basis and starting balance and yearly spending, that needs to be sent to the configuration fields, and we need it to react to changes to these values. First things first, I think what I'm going to do is just test drive this code so that it connects the user configuration to the starting balance, starting cost basis, and yearly spending properties on the component. That's pretty straightforward, so I don't expect too much trouble. All right, I got that basic test in, and the production code has been test driven, and it was really straightforward. I just set up that new user configuration, set it on the configuration panel, and then confirm that each property on the configuration panel matches the value in the user configuration object. And you can see here I'm just doing typical computed properties that are based on getting the correct value out of the value property, which I am setting here. As usual in Ember, I am not testing the handlebars template at all, so that does mean that there's the potential that errors in here will not get tested, but the test is pretty clean and I'm pretty happy with it. Now what I want to do is say that it updates user configuration when configuration fields change. And this is a bit trickier. For two reasons. First, we somehow need to get the information about the configuration field changing back to the configuration panel. And Ember has a concept of actions that I think we can use to do this. We'll send an action from the configuration field and it will bubble up through the components, and then I think we'll catch it here in the configuration panel. I'm not a big fan of having events go long distance across an application. So we'll catch it here and then translate it into our user configuration, setting a value on our user configuration. The challenge, though, is that how do we test this? How do we test that the configuration panel changes when it receives that event? Specifically, I want to make sure that it works with the configuration field, but as far as I can tell, and this isn't clearly documented, but as far as I can tell, the test framework automatically stubs out the configuration field. So there's no way to test that the two work together. So that's a problem. What we're going to have to do is test each one in isolation. We'll test that the configuration field sends the action, and we'll test that the configuration panel does something with that action. But that leaves open the chance for a typo or just a miscommunication between the two components. If I change the action that is sent in the configuration field, the configuration panel test will continue to work. This is fundamentally the problem with using mock objects, is that they don't test that things work together. I don't know what we can do about that. I think it may just be a fundamental limitation of Ember, or at least the way we're doing testing here. Since I'm not using the prescribed tool set, I can't say for sure whether or not the problems I'm seeing are in Ember or in the way I've configured it. But either way, we got a problem. So Anyway, if I'm right about doing this action stuff, which I've not done before, so I don't even know if it's right, I think we need to do this in 2 steps. First, we need to write a test around the configuration field saying that it sends the action. And second, we need to write a test around the configuration panel saying that it receives the action. And then, unfortunately, we need to do a manual test to see that it all works together. I'm going to start out, though, by just confirming that I understand how this action stuff works by doing a quick little spike and implementing the action stuff without tests just to see if it works. And then I'll revert that and start again. Okay, I didn't figure out the action stuff, but I think I've got something even better. As I was investigating the idea of sending an action from the configuration field, I realized that changing the text changes the value property. And this matters to us because we use the value property to send the numbers into the configuration field in the first place. And because of the way Ember's binding works, when this value changes, this function should get called. Specifically, we should be able to say, pass these values in, and then say if arguments.length is greater than 1, which it will pass in one argument when it's getting the value and more than one argument when it's setting the value, which is a little wonky, but whatever. Then we can say starting balance changed and output the value. And if I'm understanding this right, if changing the field will end up updating the panel, we should see some output show up in our browser. So let's go ahead and try that. If we type in something, look at that. We get starting balance changed. That is excellent. That makes things really, really easy for us. Let me go ahead and reset this. So all we need to do is 2 things. We need to write a test and configuration field that says that when the field changes, not only does it change the value of the input field, it also changes the value of the value property on the component, which we already know it does, but it's good to have that tested. So that works, no surprise there. Now what we need to do is write a test here that just says when we set the starting balance to a new value, then we'll expect the starting balance to equal approximately a new user entered dollars with the text new balance. So changing the starting balance field should result in the configuration changing as well. That should fail. And it does for exactly the right reason. We expected new balance, but we got 10,000. So making this work should just be the matter of putting in that if arguments.length is greater than 1 and saying this.get value set starting balance new user entered dollars. Yeah, there we go. Now, I wish we had the case where we had different value objects being set in these fields, because if we didn't have the luxury of specifying exactly what type of object we were creating, this would not work quite as well. And I'm not sure how we'd handle that. I think we'd have to go back to the actions. But I'm going to go ahead and call this good. I'm going to go ahead and test these other fields, and then I think we'll be good to go. I've got all 3 fields in place, and it's looking nice and clean. There's just one little problem, and it doesn't work. All the tests are passing. You can see right here all the tests are passing, but when I actually run it and load things up, we get this error, value is undefined, in line 909, which is not terribly convenient. But when I trace it through, what that turns out to mean, right here, line 909, value.render2, value is null. And I think what's happening here is that I've got this saying, set the starting balance in one case, else return. And when we set the value, apparently it's looking at the return value and sort of filtering that back through again. So I think if I take this else off and just always return, I think this will work. And I haven't tried it yet, so let's find out. Yeah, that's working now. Now the problem is that our tests don't fail. And this is exactly what I was talking about before. Right now we have bad, broken code. And it does everything that our tests say that it should do. And so all of our tests pass. But this code interacts with this code, our configuration field, and those two things are never being tested together because the tests are stubbing it out. You might call it mocking it out, but it's whatever, it's turning that field off. So I strongly believe that unit tests should be about testing the unit under test, but that unit needs to connect with the rest of the application so that these sorts of interactions get flushed out. Otherwise, you have to write a million integration tests to make it work. If this code had been actually hooked into our configuration field, we would have gotten that error, and I wouldn't have had to look in the bundle.js, which wasn't much fun either. So because we don't have that, and I do think it's a shortcoming of Ember that it automatically stubs everything out in that way, but because we don't have that, what I need to do is modify this test to say that not only has the configuration been updated, but also the component property has been updated as well. All right, and with this line in place, now I should be able to see the test fail. But I really don't like that I have to write that line because this is something that will fail automatically if everything was hooked together. So yeah, I think that's a real shortcoming of Ember is the way that it overdoes the isolation. I really feel that isolation should be kept to a minimum, to be honest. You should only isolate the components that have to be isolated for performance reasons, and otherwise keep things hooked together and design your test so that it doesn't break unless you've done something wrong in your component. That's a whole nother topic and it's a big one, so I won't go into more detail than that. But if you would like to know more, feel free to bring it up in the comments. Anyway, that's going to fix our starting balance. Yep, that's working. And now we'll do the same thing with our cost basis and our yearly spending. And there we go. Let's make sure this actually runs now. And there we go. Everything is updating like it should and no errors. Very, very good. Now, other than that isolation problem with the testing, the excessive isolation, the excessive mocking, I really, really like this. I love that the set and the get are both in the same function like this. I mean, it's weird doing arguments.length, but being able to see the set starting balance and get starting balance right next to each other, it's just beautiful. It's really, really nice. Overall, I feel like getting Ember to work the way I want has not been fun, but once I've got it, it's clean. I mean, it's really, really nice and clean. And inside the actual API, inside the actual framework, there's not a lot of magic. There's a lot of magic in the overall setup and in the tooling and so forth, but all of this stuff is nice and explicit, and I am really happy with that. It's just easy to see how everything flows from one thing to the next. And it's kind of functional as well in that the text depends on the rendered value, which depends on the value, which then we can look at our field and see that that's coming in from the panel and from there. It's just really nice. And then that's flowing in from yearly spending and cost and its value, which comes in from its container. It's all really flowing nicely. I'm just happy with how easy it is to reason about this code. Now we are very, very close to being done with getting the inter-application communication working. We now have our fields communicating to our panel, and the panel is then turning around and setting the user configuration, which, as I've mentioned, is observable. We can monitor it for changes. So all we have left to do is at the top level, when the user configuration changes, we need to regenerate our projection and put that into the table. I don't think that's going to be too complicated, so I'm going to go ahead and do that and be back in a moment. All right, I've got a basic application test set up here. I'm confirming that the application does start out with the default configuration and that it renders the stock market based on that configuration. Code is really straightforward. I just default to an empty config and calculate the projection based on that configuration. There's some duplication here between the application and the test. That's really a flaw in my domain code, But the rules of the game and the rules of engagement are that I don't change the domain code in these reviews. So I'm just sticking with that error. It showed up in all of the reviews. As usual with Ember, though, this code is not tested at all, which makes the test code nice and clean, but again, makes me worried that we are at risk of making a mistake in here and having our test pass. It's not a huge risk, and I'm not too concerned about it, but it does bug me a little bit. And when we run the application, we can see that now we do have our table reflecting this data, but it does not update yet. The individual fields update, and I'm assuming the user configuration changes, but it does not get back to the table. So that's what we need to do next. I want to say that it updates stock market table when user configuration changes. And that's really easy to test. We just need to simulate a change to the user configuration. So in this case, we'll get the config and then we will change it. Let's change the starting balance to a new user entered dollars. And then we can expect the component projection to equal the projection for that config. And this, by the way, is how you do a unit test that's all about this code, but is still linked in. We're using the real user configuration, but not making assumptions about how it works or how the domain objects work. We're just saying these are the values we're going to get out of them, and those are the values we should expect in our test. So I'm thinking this will fail. Hopefully it will. Yep, it did fail. We got a big ugly failure message. That's really just because I don't have good comparisons of objects set up. And again, that's sort of just a limitation of the domain model I've got. So now making this pass should just be a matter of listening for changes and then invalidating the projection. And I'm not sure how to do that. This projection listens to the configuration, but how do we tell it that the projection needs to change? How do we tell it that the configuration has changed under the covers? Well, I don't think it's going to be that bad. It looks like we can call notify property change, and that will tell Ember that it needs to update the property. So there's two parts to this. First, we have to call notify property change, but second, we have to call it at the right time. We have to set it up to listen to the configuration and run it when the configuration changes. And to do that, I'm going to set up an init. Init is a standard method that we can override in our components. We'll need to be able to be sure to call super. And to start out with, let's just log that we have actually initted. So if I've done that right, when we run our example, we should see hi show up. There it is. Okay, that's good. So here in our init, we should be able to say this.get configuration and then call the onChange method on that with our callback, bind that to this so that we can then turn around and call this dot, I think we want to say this dot notify property change projection. I hope I have done that right. And doing the bind means that this is the same as this one. It's basically equivalent to saying var self equals this and then self dot notify property change. And let's go ahead and go with that because I feel like that's a little bit more explicit, even though it takes another line of code. Well, will this work? I don't know. There's too many unknowns right now. I've never used notify property change before, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. Does our test pass? Well, look at that. Something's happening. It's telling us that we've disabled the run loops auto run, and we need to wrap any code with asynchronous side effects in our run. Basically, if you're calling set, you have to use ember.run. And so I take it to mean that it thinks this is calling set. And that's a good sign. It's not actually asynchronous, but Ember doesn't know that. And that's a great error message, by the way. I love that they warn us about that. Okay, we are getting a failure, but we're only failing that the example application isn't starting out with the default configuration. And that's simply due to the change handlers having something in it, which is a defect in the way I'm doing the comparison. I'm just comparing the contents of the object. I'm doing a deep compare on the objects, which is kind of bad. So I'll have to revise this test. But for now, let's just go ahead and skip that test. I think we have everything working now. It looks like it. Tests are passing. So now when we run, oh yeah, look at that. Oh my God, it is slow. It is so slow. I've heard people complain that Ember is slow, but holy crap, this is slow. Okay, watch this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Wow. Wow. And lest you think that I'm doing something dumb, the code is basically working the same way as it did for the React review. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah. Wow. So naive implementation in React and Angular works just fine. Naive implementation in Ember. Holy. That's pretty bad. But they are coming out with a new version that has a new virtual DOM, and maybe that will be fixed. I'll see if I can try that. But in the meantime, this is working, just too slow to be usable. But it is working, and I'm pretty happy with the code, the way the code turned out. We just have the listening here, and then we notify that the property's changed, and there we go. All right, I think I have got this figured out. I have basically spent a day or two working on this performance issue, and I do think it is solved. Now, I haven't actually implemented the code yet. What happened was I posted to Twitter and also the Ember.js forum asking for help, and it was really telling. The first reaction I got from everybody who responded was, "Why aren't you using Ember CLI?" I particularly like Tom Dale's reaction. Now, he's a bit biased since he's the author of Ember CLI. He says that it's like wondering why the car's not going fast. Now, we've solved the problem, and it has nothing to do with Ember CLI. So come on, guys. Roger Adams, wow. So this is another example of how you're going to run into problems if you don't do things the Ember way. They are so tied up in having their way of doing things that even if you make things work using another approach, and there's many good reasons why you would want to, the community is going to turn up their nose at you when you ask for help if you're not doing things their way, which of course means, again, using ES6 modules, not common JS modules, using Testum, using QUnit, using Broccoli, all these things that go along with Ember CLI. Now, a huge thank you to Chris Thoburn, Runspired on Twitter, although his initial reaction was, your code sucks because it's not built with Ember CLI. And in fact, what he did in order to help was he rewrote the code in Ember CLI, or really transmogrified it. Here's the code he produced. You can see that this is the Ember CLI, barfing all over the directory structure. And the components. So this is equivalent to the UI directory I have now, and then each individual component gets a directory. But other than that, and using ES6 modules, the code is exactly the same. So he transpiled the code to the Ember CLI format and figured it out. So thank you so much, Chris, for your help. I'm giving you a hard time about the Ember CLI issue, but honestly, if you had not dug into this and donated so much of your time to help me understand this, I would not be able to. So again, Runspired on Twitter, Chris Thoburn, thank you very, very much. So the outcome of this was a thread on the Ember forum where we discussed it. Chris posted his fork of the tree that had been ported to Ember CLI and fixed the issue. And then I went through and I narrowed it down to the smallest possible change that I could figure out that fixed the problem. And here is what the problem is. In our stock market table, we have the each parameter. We're going through each row in the stock market table and taking those arrays and turning them into stock market rows. The way we create that array is a fairly dumb transmogrification. It's a mapping basically from the stock market projection into an array of years, because of course Ember doesn't understand the stock market projection, it only understands arrays. It turns out that recreating this array every single time the code changes causes this problem. And you can see this if we go into the Ember inspector, which you can download for both Firefox and Chrome. It's Ember-inspector. And you load the code and we tell it to look at components. Then we make a change. You can see that each row is taking 23 milliseconds in this case. Each cell is taking 1 to 2 milliseconds. It varies. Sometimes it goes down as low as 9 milliseconds. But that's happening for each and every row, and we've got 41 of them. So the net result of this, when we look at render performance, is that every change is taking about 600 milliseconds on my Mac. Now, we are using the debug build of Ember. If we switch this over to use the production build, or specifically the minified build, it takes about 200 to 300 milliseconds, but it's still really, really slow. So that's how you would troubleshoot this, is you'd bring up the Ember inspector and start looking at performance and seeing where the issues are. From there, though, it was really just Chris's intuition and experience dealing with performance issues in Ember to know what the problem was and how the fix is. And it is because we are reproducing this array every time. The way you fix this is by not recreating the array. What we need to do is set up an intermediate variable that has the array, and once that array is created, only modify it in place. It turns out that Ember actually extends the array prototype, as far as I can tell, and adds additional methods to it, like a remove at, and object at, and insert at, that for whatever reason, and I still haven't gotten an answer on this part, for some reason, this fixes Ember's performance problem. Why? I don't know. I don't know. But it does work. So let's go ahead and implement this change. It should be just straight refactoring. What we want to do is have the stock market table have a years array, and we'll get the rows as this.get years array. So now we never reproduce the array. It's always the same array. Now the problem with that is that we're pushing the rows onto that array every single time. But what we can do is say rows I equals projection.get year offset. That will work the same way, but I don't think it solves the performance problem. Let me try to make sure the tests still pass. Yeah, they do. I actually have not tried to test drive this solution yet. I've only spiked it and tried to understand it. But now I'm going to do it in a more production-ready way. So replacing the rows in place like that, though, I don't believe solves our performance issue. Let's try it. No, it not only does not solve our performance issue, it breaks the app. And interestingly, it breaks the app in a way that does not cause the test to fail. And I think that is a symptom of our test not being real enough. So that's unfortunate. There's no exception. It just flat out breaks the code. Great. Well, this has been a pretty long episode, so I'm not going to try to figure this out. All right. Well, the correct way to do this, based on Chris's example, is to use the insert at and set parameters. So let's start out with just doing set and seeing what happens there. And what we're going to do, what he did was he had every element in the array contain an object that in turn contained the year offset. But I'm going to try just setting it with the value directly. I'm just trying to do the smallest thing that could possibly work. So we're not doing everything that was in his code. So let's set, or rather what we need to do is not set but replace, because again, we've got this mutable array which appears to be monkey patched over the top of the built-in JavaScript array, which means that all these methods are added to the built-in JavaScript array. And there's also an Ember.array that has additional methods that we don't care about because we're not mutating, I don't think. I don't know. It's getting very complicated here, but I think what we can do is replace, or rather rows.replace I, 1, comma, our year. What this is saying is in the rows array, at index whatever, replace one item with this year. And so what this will do is basically set the value. And if it doesn't exist, it will create it. What bugs me about this the most is that our tests are not failing when it stops working, and I don't know why. So yeah, there's our test working again. Now if we run it, does it actually function? Yes, it does. Once. And then we get a type error. Huh. Okay. Now I'm just flailing. I'm just blindly following Chris's code. I have no idea why this works, which again says a lot about accidental complexity. So what Chris did was he actually put an object into the array she called current. He got it out, and if it didn't exist, he created it, and then he inserted it. And then he set the value on it. So I guess that's what we're going to do. Okay, so let's do it Chris's way. So this row is rows.object@I. So get the object at this index out. If it does not exist, we'll create it and we'll insert it. And then we will set the value, ember.set this row. And then we just need some value, some property inside that object. I'm going to call it this, let's call it performance optimization. And then we can put in our year. And we need, of course, to put in our this row here and our insert at. And it's kind of bad form to define the variable inside the loop in JavaScript. So let's put this row up here. Will that work? I think it will. I don't know though, because our tests pass even when our code isn't working, which is really frustrating. Yeah, and in this case, it's not working, of course, because we haven't updated our handlebars template to account for our performance optimization. I mean, this is making it absolutely crystal clear the problems that you have when you don't actually test things together. There's excessive isolation going on here in Ember's test approach, and it's really biting us in this case. But there we go. And you can see that it's rendering much faster now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's still a little bit sluggish, but that can probably be chalked up to using the debug version of Ember. Yeah, it's happening in less than 1 millisecond, with occasional spikes up to 32 milliseconds. Yeah. Performance is still not great, but it's tons better. So that's the solution, is to, whenever you've got this for each, rather than recreating your array, modify in place with this somewhat yucky code. And this kind of stuff is error prone, because notice what we're doing here is we're inserting new rows, but we're not removing any rows. So if I were to change the projection, say it removes years when projection shrinks, this test will fail, I think. So what we'll need to do is create a new stock market projection with a different ending year. We'll just make the ending year be the first year's just 1 year later. And we'll expect the number of rows to equal, in this case, 2 for the first year and the last year. Except this needs to be our first year object, our stock market year, not the year value object. And for simplicity here, let's just make this the starting year, which means that we'll expect to see just 1 year come out. Let's try that. Yeah, look at that. It's not reducing the number of rows. We expect 41 to equal 1. I remembered to set the component's value, so that's working now. So to fix this, what we need to do is add one more line of code here, which says that after we've gone through all the projection, we want to remove everything after that. And that's going to take first the number of the element, the index of the element we want to remove, and then the number of years to remove. So the one we want to remove is the first one after the valid one, which in this case would be the number of years in the projection. So let's go ahead and factor this out into a num years variable. If we had, imagine that we have 10 years in the array, but there's only 3 years in the projection, then we want to start removing rows from the array starting with index 3, because 0, 1, and 2 are valid. Index 3 is invalid, which happens to be the same as the number of years. Remember, there are 3 years in the projection. So we'll remove starting with the number of years in the projection, and the amount we remove is all of them, the difference between the length of the array and the number of years, which is rows.length minus number of years. So in this case, 10 minus 3 is 7. We want to remove 7 rows. And if we do that, then we finally have, I believe, a valid test. Of course, that doesn't entirely work. We're getting an index out of range because when the number of years has not changed, then, or when it hasn't shrunk, then this is larger than the number of rows in the array. So what we have to do is we have to say if num years is less than the length of the array, then we remove it. What a cluster. Oh, man. But that does do the trick, and let's make sure it also adds a year when the projection grows. This I expect will work, because we already have that insert in there. So now instead of having 41 years, it should have 42, and there we go. So that fixes the performance issue with rendering the stock market table. I usually don't like to go into these sorts of things in these reviews, but I really had no choice. It was so ridiculously slow before that if I hadn't fixed it, it'd be a real problem. Again, what we did here was we modified our stock market table to keep the years array and all of its objects, all of its sub-objects, and then we just modified a value inside of those objects. I don't like this code. I feel like it is messy and reflects a real flaw in the way Ember works, that we have to do this for something so basic. But what I do like is that the code is nicely self-contained. We are able to just modify this component that was experiencing the problem and fix the application. We didn't have to do anything crazy like rebuild everything for Ember CLI. Or more specifically, we didn't have to do anything crazy like redesign our entire application for this issue. All right, we are done, right? We got this updating. It's performant-ish enough. It's all working. So that is it, right? Well, no, there's one more thing that I want to do, and that is getting the simulated persistence layer to send us results back from the simulated server. We've done this in the Angular and React reviews as well. So when this value changes, I want to see everything update. Should not be that hard. Oh God, famous last words. Why do I always say that? Okay, here's the deal. We just sort of fake it. We've got this set interval here, which will go ahead and change our yearly spending every half a second. And we want to see that update in these 3 fields and in this table. And I don't think that will work out of the box because we haven't coded anything to work that way. So let's go ahead and give it a shot. Oh, look at that. So our table is updating because it's handling the onChange event on our user configuration, but our user configuration is not updating. So that's obviously a little bit of an issue. So the very last thing I want to do is go into our configuration panel and modify it to support changes. So we'll open our configuration panel test and our configuration panel. And what we wanted to do here is not only update the user configuration when the configuration fields change, but also update configuration fields when user configuration changes. So what we're going to do here is set the starting cost basis to new cost basis, or rather let's start with the new starting balance. And again, we can't check that the HTML bars is correct, but what we can do is we can expect the components starting balance to equal the new balance. And I expect that that test will fail. Yeah, and in fact it does. We're getting 10,000, we're expecting new balance. So that should be pretty easily fixed. What we need to do, well, actually I'm not sure. We need to get the configuration panel's properties to update when the starting cost basis changes, or when the starting balance changes, which means that we need to listen for changes on the starting balance or on the config. Okay, it looks like what we're going to want to do is use the observable class, and the easiest way to do that is to say .observes. So what I'm thinking is that here in our configuration panel, we'll observe the value with a hidden variable, a hidden property called, config watcher. That will be called whenever the value changes, and let's just log the arguments for now. It's a little bit hard to tell, but I think what we're going to get is the same thing that we get on our other functions, which is the key, the new value, and the previous value. So we're going to say config this. That gives us our value, our user configuration object, on change, notify property change on value. All right, I figured it out, and I'm not thrilled about it. You have to say on init here if you want the observer to run when the component first initializes. So because we initialize the component with the value property in place, and that value property is not changed in our production code, the observer is not ever running. But if we do this on init, it will. And you can see it here. We'll say console.log config watcher. So if I take that on init out and we run it, there's no config watcher happening. But if we add that on init and rerun, now you can see config watcher is running. But unfortunately, it's firing every single time. And this is the loop I was concerned about. We're calling notify property change on value, which is causing the config watcher to run again, which I don't really want. There's a couple of things that are bothering me here. One is that this is running multiple times, and it's easily fixed. We can just notify a property change on underscore value and have this listen for underscore value, but still get the config out of regular value, and that should fix the problem. We should only see one config watcher running. And in fact, we do. We just see one. So that's the finished code. That's how it's supposed to work. But then the other question is, how do we test this? And why didn't our tests fail when we didn't have this on init? I don't know the answer to that. And there's enough of a disconnect between our test code and our production code that I'm not confident it can be fixed. There's this huge disconnect between what our tests see and what the user sees, and that is a huge failing in test infrastructure. You just don't want that. You want your test and your production code and your user to see the same results. And the fact that we're not, that's a real problem. But on the positive side, you can see that finally we're seeing the value update just like it's supposed to. So that's really good. Let's start our wrap up with a review of what we've built. At the very top level, we have our index.html, which just loads Ember and our JavaScript bundle. Ember, in turn, automatically sets up the app. This code is run when we say ember.application.create. That sort of gets everything going. And then in there, we have to set some global variables and set up a custom resolver in order to get Ember to actually find our common JS modules. And figuring out this custom resolver was a real hassle. But the good news is once we had it done, we left it alone. It was sort of fire and forget. The real work of the application is done here in example application and our example application handlebars template or HTML bars template. We've got a configuration panel and a stock market table. The configuration panel consists of configuration fields, and the stock market table consists of stock market rows and individual cells. All of these things know how to render arbitrary value objects that can be in an invalid or invalid state and can be positive or negative. And that code is here in our stock market table and our stock market row and our stock market cell for the stock market table, and here in our configuration panel and configuration field for the configuration panel and field. A couple of things that were challenging about this. Our stock market table had some severe performance problems, so we had to implement a performance workaround. It was nicely encapsulated, but the code is ugly and error prone, so that's something to be aware of. Stock market row really was very straightforward, but we did discover at that point that our tests, we're not testing everything hooked together. It was mocking out or stubbing out the stock market cells, which introduced a disconnect between what our tests were doing and what the real users of the application see, which has caused us several problems as we've gone through this. Our stock market cell was pretty clean. It implements our very funky and weird value object architecture, intentionally funky and weird, and it handled that nice and clean. Our configuration panel, it started out really clean, and I like the way that the setting of the values is right next to the getting of the values. That was pretty neat. But once we started bringing in watching for changes on our persistence layer, it got very ugly with these underscore value and observes and on and it, none of which I really feel was adequately tested. It is quite possible that there is a better way of doing this. This is the very last thing I did, and it's been a lot of time working on this, and I've kind of gotten tired of struggling with Ember. So maybe there's a better way, and I just don't know it. But this was clean, and then it started to get dirty once we brought in more concepts. Configuration field was like stock market cell. It's what's responsible for rendering value objects, and I feel like that went pretty smoothly. One thing that is notable about Ember is you've got this sort of functional values flowing through the system. So a tooltip depends on a rendered value depends on value, which in turn comes from the configuration panel, and the configuration panel's HTML bars. So here's the value, which depends on starting balance, and then the starting balance depends on underscore value, which in turn depends on, well, that gets kind of weird, but that then turns on value, which is set here. It's neat how it all flows through. I like that aspect of it, but I do wonder if it might be hard to reason about over time because it's not always obvious how these things connect. It's more of a pull system than a push, so the action can sometimes be at a distance. So that's the code. Now, how did it do on our pitfalls? Is Ember.js a good front-end framework to use? Let's take a look. Now remember, we're looking at maintainability here, and I have 5 common pitfalls: lock-in, opinionated architecture, accidental complexity, poor testability, and inability to do server-side rendering. On the first of these, lock-in, well, Ember is no worse than most frameworks. It has its own custom templating language, HTML bars, which actually you can use elsewhere, and its own way of doing all the JavaScript associated with those. And these two things together are pretty much importable. You're not going to be able to use them elsewhere, so you are locked in. This would not be enough to get us a frowny face in most cases, but Ember takes it a little bit further by really wanting to own the rest of your world too. You're supposed to use Ember's object model, Ember data, the Ember command line, Ember CLI. They really want you to be in their ecosystem and doing everything in their ecosystem. And as I discovered when I had a performance problem, when I didn't do everything in their ecosystem, when I didn't use Ember CLI, people's default reaction was to say, we can't help you because you're not doing it our way. So yeah, if you're doing Ember, you want to do it their way, and then you will be heavily locked in. So this is definitely a failure for Ember. Second, opinionated architecture. Well, actually, the architecture of Ember is really good. I didn't have too much trouble making things work with my intentionally weird stuff. Now, we did have some issues in terms of the configuration panel, for example, not wanting to interface with our user configuration object. And I'll bet you the Ember folks would say that I was doing it wrong by not using an Ember object. That's really more of a question of lock-in. Actually, getting this to come in was not too much trouble. And the issues we had, I would say, are more a question of accidental complexity than opinionated architecture. So architecture is pretty clean. I liked Ember's architecture. The problem is the tooling is so badly locked in. They want you to use Ember CLI, which means that you are stuck using QUnit, Broccoli, Testum, ES6 modules. They make all these choices for you, and if you don't go down their paved cow paths. They like to talk about paving cow paths. What they've left is a blasted nuclear landscape everywhere else, though. There's no option to make any new cow paths. Um, their metaphor of paving cow paths is, let's see where the users are going and make that easy. But by focusing on what they do, because when they say the users, I think they mostly mean themselves, because the people who develop Ember use it in their day job. By making Ember really support the way they like to use it, they've left a real disaster for those of us who want to work a different way. And that's why they're getting a failure, a frowny face on opinionated architecture. It's actually not the architecture that's opinionated, it's the tooling, and it is terribly, terribly opinionated. It is just bad. I had so much trouble trying to figure out how to make this stuff work. Now, in the end, I was able to make it work, and it was even pretty clean, like the way we plugged in the CommonJS resolver. That was pretty clean, but the documentation was terrible, and the community is not supportive around it. Next, accidental complexity. The API is pretty well thought out. It is quite big, but it is well thought out. There's just a lot of stuff in here. And they've done something that is really popular in the Ruby and Rails community that I think is a poor decision, which is monkey patching. They are actually adding things onto the array object, onto function objects, and so forth. So that introduces some complexity. It does have some warts, though, particularly around tooling. Performance obviously is not very good, which added complexity. The documentation looks good at first glance, but it handholds too much and doesn't treat you as an intelligent partner enough. So you end up spending, once you get past the really basics, it's hard to see what's going on. For example, there was nothing in the Ember guide that I saw that told me that, hey, Ember is modifying the default array prototype. And if you want to modify array, you have this mutable array option. That just wasn't in there. And of course, I haven't gone through and read all of these API documentations. There's just way too much stuff in here. So yeah, it's pretty big and it does have some warts. And even though it is pretty good, I found myself reading a lot of Ember code, like way more code than I've read for any of the other frameworks I've reviewed, which is React and Angular. And of course, I've done a lot of work with jQuery as well. Who hasn't? I've read more Ember code than any of those other libraries and frameworks. And I think that says something about complexity. Now, part of the reason I was doing that was because I was running into performance problems. I was running into tooling problems. But when you run into problems, not being able to figure out, having to read code, that's a strong side of complexity. So although the API is well thought out, it's too big, and I found myself reading too much code, and there's just a few too many warts for me to give it a smiley face. But it's not too bad. Testability, not good. It is testable. And by using the Mocha adapter rather than the built-in QUnit adapter, I may have been running into problems that most Ember users don't run into. But there were too many cases, as with the configuration panel tests, as with the stock market row, where what I was testing was not what actually was showing up in the browser. And that's an unacceptable failing in a test tool, in my opinion. So that, and the fact that in order to support a test framework, you've got to sort of dig into Ember details, and that if you want to use something other than QUnit or Mocha, you're kind of in trouble. That leads me to give a frowny face to Ember. The automatic stubbing is not good. The disconnect between test results and real results is not good. And the fact that you are limited in which frameworks you can use and supporting new frameworks is not documented and apparently not easy. That is all just bad. Sorry, Ember, you fail pretty badly on the testing front. And then finally, server-side rendering. This is usually a binary yes or no. Most frameworks do not support server-side rendering. Ember does not yet, but they've got a fast boot project that's part of their push to move to a virtual DOM, like the one React has, that is supposedly going to enable it. So I'm going to give them a pass on this one and say, well, maybe it will come out. We'll just have to wait and see. One more thing that doesn't really fit into this, the Ember community was really supportive. They were very responsive, and I want to say thank you and kudos to the Ember community for really providing me with so much help. Now, I wish that I hadn't needed so much help, and I think that speaks to accidental complexity. But every time I tweeted, there was somebody there trying to help me, and some folks, such as Chris Thoburn, were extremely generous with their time. So thanks very much. And that is a strong point in favor of Ember. If you do decide to use it, I think the community will be one of your greatest assets. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that Ember is updating rapidly. They are on a 6-week release cycle. I think it's fantastic that they're on such a quick release cycle, and they're working really hard to make sure that each release is backward compatible. However, there are a lot of complaints that each release is also quite big and at least breaks Ember CLI, if not the framework itself. But of course, you can't really use Ember without using Ember CLI if you want to take advantage of the community, which again, I think is its biggest strength. So that's something to be aware of. There's a lot of flux in the Ember world right now. They're trying to manage it, but they're not being totally successful. The core framework is managing the change well, as far as I can tell, but the tooling is not. And tooling, of course, is tightly coupled with Ember itself. So bottom line, what do I think of Ember? Well, I like it better than Angular, but not as much as React. Really, it feels like Ember is trying to be the Ruby on Rails, the Rails of the JavaScript world. Yehuda Katz has got a strong Rails background. They've got sort of this very opinionated convention over configuration, do it our way, use our tools, and everything will just magically work out for you approach. And if that's what you're looking for, then Ember is not a bad choice. I think Ember is a solid tool that's got a positive future, and a lot of the things that I'm talking about here may not be an issue in a year because they are changing so rapidly. But for me, and for those of you looking for my thoughts on maintainability, I would not recommend Ember at this time, and probably not ever, because the general philosophy of doing things for you, paving cow paths, but then inadvertently blowing up the rest of the world, this strong opinionated architecture or opinionated tooling and convention over configuration, I don't think that's a recipe for long-term success. So Ember does what it does pretty darn well, but I don't think it's doing the right thing. And as a result, I recommend against it. That's it for my review of Ember.js. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.